The cult that Graham Hancock has created is very dangerous. And I say this after just watching Professor Flynn Dibble's video on an interview that Graham Hancock did in the early 90s, where Professor Dibble comes out and pretty much shows how what Graham was back then and still is today is this doomsday cultist, and that the pseudo-archaeology and pseudoscience that he teaches and preaches and surrounds himself with is in fact very dangerous. And now, I'm not an archaeologist, I'm a law professor, I'm a historian, and my area of scholarly research is in the laws and codes that sustained and maintained the antebellum slaveocracy here in the United States. As I've said, and many times on this channel you've heard me say, and many scholars have said the same thing, that the antebellum South was not a society with slaves, it was in fact a slave society. And that's what I study. I study the laws that this system was created around and was used to continue and maintain this system. And one of the striking things that I've seen in my research is how the ideas of Graham Hancock were used, even in the antebellum period, to justify the enslavement of Africans and people of African descent. And that is why I say that it is so dangerous. Now, many videos I've said and other people have said at length that none of us really believe that Graham Hancock himself is racist. Of course he's not. He's married to a black woman, I believe, and no one said that anything he has ever said is him preaching racism. However, what he does say, and the fact that he ignores historical truths that are supported by evidence, is in fact dangerous and does lead to and perpetuate racism. What do I mean by that? I say that there would be a difference, right? And I want to make this clear. I was trying to explain this to my daughter's a sophomore in college, and she's taking some history classes. Not her major. I couldn't get her into it. But, you know, we do have talks about history and things like that at times. And what I was trying to explain to her is that what Graham Hancock does is he ignores these historical truths, these archaeological truths, things that have been proven with almost no question. And he continues to push the myth that an advanced civilization was required in order to do things like create the pyramids. It would be one thing if the evidence that the Egyptians did it didn't exist. No one could fault him or people like him for saying or looking back and going, wow, people 2, 3, 4,000 years ago, there's no way they could have done this. There must have been some higher society, some higher intelligence, some technology that has been lost to time that enabled them to do that. No one, I think, whether that's any of the archaeologists here on YouTube, and again, I'm outside of my field here. I'm not an archaeologist, but I'm just saying, I don't think any archaeologist here in social media, any of the science educators here on YouTube, would argue that that would not be an unreasonable position to take. The problem is the proofs are all there. I love Expedition Unknown. I think the show has changed its name so many times, but it's Josh Gates on Discovery Channel. He's that archaeologist who goes around and does some of these things. And I was watching it on Sunday, and he was doing an episode on the pyramids in Egypt. And the episode was great because it showed how the Egyptians were able to pull massive stones using the technology they had, which didn't include the wheel. It showed how archaeologists have done these awesome surveys of the site at Giza and shown how there are post holes. And again, this is what I watch on the Discovery Channel, so I'm not saying that this is rote, but again, archaeologists can back me up on this or say that this has been disproven, whatever. But the point is, there are proofs, there are evidences that show that there were post holes, which showed how they were surveying and laying out parts of the foundation of the Great Pyramid. There are journals from some of the builders who talk about doing it and why it was done and that it was a tomb. We have all of this evidence, and he denies that to go back and say, no, there must have been a greater civilization. And therein lies the problem. Because what he is doing, whether he means to do it or not, is saying these Egyptians, these simpletons, these peasants, these uneducated, technologically, lacking society could not have done what they did. And that's what leads us down the road to this idea of racial superiority. Some groups are incapable. They could never have done such a thing like that. And that's where it becomes dangerous. So the fact that the evidence and proof is there, and Graham Hancock continues to ignore it to push his own agenda, which Flint Dibble has pointed out, others have pointed out, has changed over the years. Why? Because it's a grift. It's meant to make money. And as things are disproven, he has to adapt and overcome and change it in order to continue to make money off of said thing. But when you say that a society couldn't have done it in spite of all the evidence, that's when you end up like the enslavers in the antebellum South, who justified slavery because they believed that Africans and people of African descent were an inferior race and needed to be enslaved by the Caucasian, by the master race, by the white race, in order to better their natural condition. And I would even say that the jurists of the time of the antebellum South, such as Thomas R.R. Cobb, who I cite a lot on this, who wrote An Inquiry into the Laws of Negro Slavery, which is, the magnum opus of antebellum slave law. I actually hold Graham Hancock to be more liable and responsible for the things he does rather than someone like Thomas R.R. Cobb, because Thomas Cobb, while looking to Africa and saying that there was no way that civilizations in Africa could have done what they had done, they did not have the same evidence that people like Graham Hancock have today. So in Thomas Cobb's ignorance, he pushed this racist, bigoted pseudoscience idea. Graham Hancock doesn't have that same luxury. He is living in the 21st century where we have all this evidence, we have all these proofs, and he chooses to deny it, and that is what leads down the same path. So, for example, if we look into the laws, An Inquiry into the Laws of Negro Slavery in the United States of America, they point to Africa and the triumphs of things like Egypt as an example for, the Africans could never have done this. It wasn't done by their race. It was done by another race. Therefore, they are inferior. Therefore, we can justify slavery. So we'll look into it. We'll lead into it a little bit. He says, mentally inferior now certain he is. The mind of the Negro is inferior to that of the European, and his organization is less perfect. The typical woolly-haired races have never invented a reasoned theological system, discovered an alphabet, framed a grammatical language, nor made the least step in science or art. They have never comprehended what they have learned or retained a civilization taught them by contact with more refined nations as soon as that contact has ceased. And then he brings up Egypt itself. He says, yet the Negro tribes of Africa have never received or exhibited its influences, that they have never produced a single example of organized government, that they have never exhibited the first evidence of a self-evolving civilization, not even in the formation of an alphabet, a hieroglyphic, or a symbol, much less a grammatical language. We are referred to Egypt, the cradle of literature and sciences, and triumphantly asked if Africa was not the very fountain whence all the streams of enlightenment flow. That there were Negroes in Egypt as slaves at that period, there can be no doubt. But that the ruling caste of the Egyptians were of the Caucasian race is equally free from difficulty. In fact, it was the boast of one of the pharaohs that no native Egyptians had placed a brick in one of the huge pyramids that he built. So, Thomas Cobb is using, 1850s Egyptology and history to justify that the people who actually built the pyramids were not the indigenous peoples of Africa or even Arabs, they were Caucasians. And he even talks about how Arabs are a level of Caucasian. This is the mental gymnastics you have to jump through to justify the enslavement of a race of human beings in the antebellum South. My point being that looking at Egypt and saying that could not have been done by the indigenous peoples, that could not have been done by people of African descent, is a racist position to hold. It is saying that they are inferior because they could not have created the things that they created or done the things they have done. Now, in Thomas Cobb's defense, which I hate to say, that should never be said ever, but comparing him to Graham Hancock, Thomas Cobb had the excuse of the limited knowledge available to someone who very rarely ever left the state of Georgia, and the information that was available to him, as opposed to Graham Hancock, who we now know we have archaeological proof and evidence of the creation of the pyramids and who it was done for and by, etc. Yet he continues to this day in 2025 to peddle this myth of an advanced civilization was required in order to do all of these things. So yes, Graham Hancock is dangerous. His teachings, his preachings, his doomsday cult, all of this is dangerous because it is exactly what was used to support the institution of African slavery in the United States during the antebellum period. So when we don't stand up to this, when we don't do something to confront it, we are allowing groups like white supremacists, neo-Confederates, neo-Nazis, all of those groups who Graham Hancock says, I'm not condoning or teaching or preaching to these groups. No, you're not, but they are taking your message and running with it because it is the same foundation that was used to justify racial superiority in past times. So I just wanted to put that out there because it was, Dr. Dibble's video really struck a chord with me about how, Graham is so irresponsible in this that he has the proofs and evidence yet ignores it. And, that is what is going to lead to this continued pushing of this narrative of racial superiority or inferiority with these indigenous peoples around the world who were far smarter and far more advanced than we ever give them credit for. So as always, remember to like, subscribe, share, and I'll see you for the next video.